Hi, well, it's me again, and I'm going to talk about something today that sometimes brings questions to people's minds. Because when you say something like, God said something to me or God spoke to me, you got to be really careful about that kind of a thing because you could be putting words in God's mouth, which is dangerous. Now, I do believe that God speaks to us today, and usually it's not some audible voice out of the sky. Usually it's an inner voice or something that interrupts your very being. And I'm not anybody special that unless we're all special, because God will speak to any of us, especially if we're into His Word and if we're giving time to the Lord daily and stuff. We spend time with Him. If you're going to ignore Him all day long, I don't think He's going to say much to you. I mean, He might be saying something to you, but you're not going to hear Him. So I don't want to get. I don't want you to think that I'm somebody that God talks to all the time. But when He has spoken to me, it's been something that I knew, that I knew, that I knew. Giving reference to some of the stories I already told about the moose. God woke me up one morning and said, if you go, I'll give you a moose. And you can find that story, and it's right there on one of those squares right down there. So go look it up. And there was other times that I've told stories here about when God spoke to me, and I'm sure that He did. And this is one that I wouldn't call this one a miracle, but I would say it's one of those times when God spoke to me, or I really believe He did. And I can't say it was audible, but I tell you what, it was loud enough to be audible, loud enough in my inner voice or on the inside of me. And there's no way that I can really tell or describe it. But this is what really happened. You see, I was through having children. I had two kids, Tammy and Kelly, my boy and my girl. And they were 7 and 8 years old, and I had my life all planned. 2 children was all I wanted, and so we were living life that way. And I had things planned. There one day I would probably go into a ministry, which, of course, if you've been following me along, you know that I did eventually go into a ministry. But before that all happened, I had plans to do things that never quite got done. And at the time this happened, I was a policeman for Boise, Idaho. Well, anyway, somewhere along the line, my wife all of a sudden tells me that she's expecting a child. I mean, she's pregnant. And I'm totally in shock because this was 8 years after we quit having children. And I just didn't really want another child. And so I was pretty disappointed, and so was she. But we didn't know how to face this disappointment, except it just showed in both of us. And it seemed like there for the next week or so, we had a hard time talking to one another. We were angry at ourselves, angry at each other, and we were foolish, okay? Let's put it that way. We were just downright foolish, and I was complaining about it, and yes, I even had thoughts, God forgive me, I even had thoughts of abortion. That would never be something I would consider, but the thought was there. Of course, I wouldn't give that thought much room, because I just cannot believe that I'd have that kind of thing where you kill a baby. I can't do that. And so the temptation wasn't there, but the thought was there. And I just was looking for a way not to have this child. And it was one night while we were in bed, and we were going to go to sleep, and we'd said our prayers, and I'm laying there, but I'm laying there with my back at my wife. She's laying there with her back towards me and my back towards her, and we're kind of not really speaking to each other very much. We were still depressed over the fact that we're going to have to spent 9 months and then several years taking care of another baby, which I had plans, and it was ruining my plans. And I don't know what I was going to say, but I turned to my wife to say something to her. And it wasn't going to be nice. It was going to be something negative. And as I tried to open my mouth and say it, whatever it was, I was interrupted. And I heard it so loud, I heard it so clear, it interrupted my being, like as if almost like thunder would interrupt you when you're talking. It interrupted what I was about to say, and the words were just exactly this way. Before the world was, I knew him. And I just stopped, and my wife looked at me and she says, "What's the matter?" I said, "I believe God just spoke to me." "Oh, yeah? Well, what did he say?" "Before the world was, I knew him. We're going to have a boy. We're going to have a boy. Before the world was, I knew him." And I said, I know that I heard this. I know I heard this said in my mind. And for some reason or other, from that moment on, my whole countenance changed, and so did hers. And I said, who are we to have a negative attitude about somebody that God planned before the world was? That God knew before the world was and was going to choose us to bring him into the world. And so from that moment on, our whole attitude changed, and we were excited about having this baby boy that was coming. And so, and to make the long story short, of course, 9 months goes by, and here is the day that he was born, and definitely, just like God said, him. He was born. And that's Daryl. Matter of fact, Daryl has been helping me with this whatever it is we're doing here. And he's been running the camera for me. But this story has a little add-on. Oh, by the way, I wrote down some scriptures where God where God says that he knew us before the world was. There's Jeremiah 1:4, Psalms 139, 1 Peter 1:20, and Galatians 1:15. Now that's just one or about 4 or 5 of the few of the scriptures where God says he knew us before we were born. So, by the way, I'll throw in a little bit of preaching here, or whatever you call it. Don't ever abort your baby, because God planned something for that child before the world was. And if you don't believe it, read those scriptures that I just gave you. Go back and play this again and get those scriptures and write them down. Because if you decide you think it's okay to abort and to kill the baby, you're kind of telling God to, I don't want to say you're rebelling against God. So don't ever do something like that, because God knew him or her before the world was. Okay, so now Daryl was born, and life goes on for a while. And Daryl is about 10, 12, maybe 13 years old. And we're out in the woods, and we're picking huckleberries. I'll never forget this day. And I don't know what it was, but when we'd go out and pick huckleberries together, I would talk to my son and tell him different things about what happened before he was born and all that. And then I decided it was time to tell Daryl that there was a time I didn't want him. There was a time when I didn't want him to be born. And so I was telling him the story. And I said, but there's a real good thing about this whole thing. I said, you know where in the Bible on Judgment Day that God talks to he puts the goats on one side and the sheep on the other, and he says to some of them, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Well, look, over in Acts 9:15 is just one example. You look that up, Acts 9:15. where God does that. But I said to Daryl, I said, keep this in mind, Daryl. And of course, by this time, Daryl knew the Lord. He was a Christian, even though he's only about 9 or 10 or 12 years old. I don't remember which. But I said, God can never look at you now and say to you, depart from me, I never knew you. Because he's already told me before the world was, I knew him. Well, you should have seen the look on Daryl's face. It was amazing. It was like somebody took a 200-pound rock off of the top of his shoulders or something. He just totally almost collapsed. He just relaxed. Well, I know what it was. It was such a relief to finally realize that when God saves you, and when God promises you that you're saved and you have that relationship with him, you don't have to worry about whether you're going to hell or heaven. You know where you're going. And you don't have to worry about God saying to you someday, depart from me, I never knew you, because God said he knew you before the world was. So it totally changed his whole countenance, and it made a whole different person out of him from that moment on. So I wanted to add that to the story. Like I said, this is not what I'd call a miracle, but it's one of those stories that I think should be told, because I'm leaving anything I can think of and anything that God did for me while I was here on earth. And so this is just one of them, and I got a lot more to do. So be sure and ring that bell down there and keep an eye out, because I'm going to be telling some more stories. And like I said, that's just done so unprofessionally, we don't care. This is the way I can do it, and this is the way it's going to get done. I sure appreciate you tuning in. Tell your friends about it. By the way, go look at some of those videos where I was singing and yodeling. You got pictures of me and videos of me singing and sharing in the churches, and some of the Full Gospel Businessmen meetings and stuff. So you can look at all of those, and that's when I used to do a lot of yodeling, and I've already told you some of those stories. So, and how I started yodeling in church. So look them up. Don't just look at this one, look at the rest of them, and pass it on to your friends. God bless you, and thanks for tuning in. Ring that bell.